Welcome to Better Teaching, Only Stuff That Works, a podcast for teachers, instructional coaches, administrators, and anyone else who supports teachers in the classroom. This show is a proud member of the BE Podcast Network, shows that help you go beyond education. Find all our shows at bepodcastnetwork.com. I am Gene Tavernetti, the host for this podcast, and my goal for this episode, like all episodes, is that you laugh at least once and that you leave with an actionable idea for better teaching. A quick reminder, no cliches, no buzzwords, only stuff that works. If you've been listening to this podcast, then you know that I think that the future of schools in the United States are going to be very specialized schools. They'll have an identity, they'll have a theme. And with that in mind, we're going to talk to somebody today. My guest started a microschool and has an interesting background. And I think you're going to be interested in her background as well as her microschool Star Lab. So my guest today is Alison Rini. And after 25 years of teaching and leading public, private, and charter schools, she left the school system and designed a microschool called Star Lab. In order to bring the vision to reality, Alison received a fellowship from the Drexel Fund, providing support and training to design an outstanding educational program accessible to low-income families. Alison is passionate about brain science, learning principles, and human flourishing. She intentionally set Star Lab in a low-income zip code of Sarasota, Florida, to test the assumption that 95% of children can learn to read given proper instruction. Star Lab is entering its third year of operation, growing from 5 students in its first year to 20 students last year to 50 students for the school year starting this August. Many of the students who come to Star Lab have had struggles in their previous placements, and Alison's goal is to prove that children growing up in public housing can achieve at the highest levels when school is designed around how children actually learn. Alison has 3 degrees from Columbia University in neuroscience, curriculum, and leadership, and she has learned the most in the past few years of her school design journey actually working at Star Lab. I think you're really going to like this one. Alison, welcome to Better Teaching, Only Stuff That Works.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure to be on.
Oh, I am looking forward to this and I think folks are going to be very interested to learn more about you before we talk about Star Lab. I want to talk a lot about the microschool that you started, Star Lab. But first, I think there's some interesting things in your background, your history, your bio, that I think some people also find pretty interesting. And one of the things I wanted to start with is that you did your undergraduate work at Columbia University, and your undergraduate degree was in neuroscience and behavior.
Yes.
When did you get into education? That's usually not the route that people take.
Yeah, my whole life has been full of surprises. I took AP psychology in high school, and I remember the teacher saying, this next chapter is going to be the worst one, the most boring one. We'll get through it, and then we'll get to the good stuff. And that chapter was on brain anatomy, and it was my favorite. And so when I went to college, I just walked in knowing I want to do neuroscience. I'm very interested in that. And so I wasn't really sure where it would lead. I did an independent study my senior year, and my professor said, what do you want to do for your independent study? I said, well, I'd like to figure out how learning works. He's like, well, that's kind of a big topic for an undergraduate to solve in 4 months. So we ended up studying just one particular circuit that's involved in learning called long-term potentiation, which is where if 2 neurons are activated simultaneously, the connection between them grows. And they say, if something fires together, they wire together. So I learned about how learning could become basically associations could develop. I thought it was really interesting, but I didn't get into teaching until a couple years after I graduated. I just kept gravitating towards kids and finally realized that was sort of the missing element for me. I was interested in learning. I loved kids. And so I went back to school for education.
I have to ask, this is just total personal interest. What did you do in those gap years? What sort of work were you doing? What were you qualified to do based on your degree?
So I decided to become a nomadic farmer for a little while. So there's this incredible program. I'm pretty sure it still exists. The acronym is WOOF, and it stands for Willing Workers on Organic Farms. And so you can go and intern on these different organic farms, just help them with whatever farm tasks there are, and they feed you and house you. And so I was in British Columbia for a while. I went to Kauai for a while. And then we're getting pretty random, but I went to Tanzania for 6 months, just thinking I would learn so much about farming. And that's actually where I decided to get into education.
Or did you have some experiences with kids there that made you want to do that? Or
Yes, I was in a city and they were looking for a science teacher for their sixth grade class. And I said, I love science and I love kids and I speak English, and I've been to school. I'm sure the teachers listening would love that part. So I thought, what else is there to learn? Of course, it's not that easy to work in a foreign country. All the best intentions ended up, there was just not a possibility of getting a visa. And so I came back to New York and said, well, now that I've got this intention to become a teacher, I'll get my degree and next time I'll be more prepared. So I went to Teachers College for elementary ed.
so you not only came back with more direction and maturity,
Hmm.
and then you went back, like you said, for your master's. And one of the things we didn't mention in your biography, but could you talk about one of the instructors who you had there at Columbia College that people might be interested in?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So I got a job assistant teaching and I didn't know what to do. It turned out there's more to teaching than just having been a student. And so I started looking for books and I got Lucy Calkins' book. I think it's called like The Art of Teaching Reading or something. And I loved it. It was just so, exciting and happy and positive and everything's going to work just perfectly. And so when I signed up for my degree, I was actually able to choose which reading course I wanted to learn. I chose her. So I got a whole year long instruction with Lucy Calkins in the reading and writing project. That we learned all the units of study. She was still developing them at that time. The school I was working at was PS6 in New York City. It was very closely affiliated with her work. And so we constantly had professional development where, one of her staff would come and guide us in a unit of study. I was teaching fourth and fifth grade at that time, and so I wasn't teaching kids to decode. They already knew how. So I had a great time with the reading and writing project because I wasn't teaching kids to read. I was working with kids who could read on reading more. So we were doing things like, mystery partnerships. We were doing, social issue book clubs. For writing, we were writing personal narratives. We were writing articles. And I thought it was a great success. I saw a lot of growth in my kids and I saw them doing really well. It was much, much later that I started to learn about the controversies.
So, so were you teaching when you were learning about the controversies?
No, no. So I learned, how to teach reading and writing from Lucy. And it was always a little bit confusing, to be honest. The grades that I was teaching, I felt like I understood, but I didn't really understand the concept of how they taught the kindergartner through second graders. One of her tenets that she would tell us was every day you teach a mini lesson, and every mini lesson you teach something the students can use for the rest of their lives. And we said, okay, so what is that? Could you just give us a little more
Yeah.
to go off of? And I remember her feeling a little frustrated that we didn't know. But at one point she said, well, for example, the letter B. You could teach the letter B. They'll use that the rest of their lives. And I was like, oh, great. Okay. I guess I got 26 lessons then, if I'm teaching kindergarten or first grade, great. But there's 180 school days, so what else? So, but I didn't apply it because, like I said, I was teaching upper elementary and I kept teaching upper elementary the whole time I was in the classroom. When I became an administrator, I would have the lower elementary teachers come to me and say, I'm really struggling here. Like a first grade teacher came to me and said, my students have not really mastered short vowels, so I cannot go on to long vowels. And I said, okay, great. And then a couple of weeks later, one of her colleagues came in and said, she's not teaching long vowels yet. She's still teaching short vowels. What's going on? Our grade is, in shambles. And so, but I didn't have anything to draw on to give guidance. I was just kind of being supportive. And so, in retrospect, I feel terrible that I didn't have the information or the framework to encourage her to go on with long vowels because short vowels aren't going away. They'll still be there.
Yeah,
They'll still
yeah.
get practice with that. So it was much later as an administrator that I started to realize I didn't really know how to guide the teachers who were struggling.
And so you just knew you knew what wasn't working,
Right.
but you weren't sure about how to help them. But then at what point did you learn about science of reading, explicit instruction, et cetera? Were you still an administrator at that point?
No, it's kind of a miracle that it happened when it did. I had been working at a Title I school as an assistant principal during COVID and the aftermath. And we may talk about it later, but it was, obviously very challenging for the teachers, the students, the families. And I was just starting to feel like, kind of like a middleman. I didn't feel like I was really providing solutions. I felt like I was just sort of placating people because there were so many usual situations that didn't fit the typical categories. Like if a post-COVID, Florida opened up in August of 2020, but other states didn't open up for like a lot of that 2021 school year. And so we'd have kids move to our school who hadn't sat in a classroom for a year and a half. So they were super behind, but the only way to get them the services they needed was basically to identify them with a learning disability. They couldn't just go to a different classroom. And it was very frustrating for me to see people kind of getting caught in the system and being unable to truly help them. So I decided to leave the system and start my own school. And so I started spending a lot of time on Twitter, just kind of like diving into all of these, brilliant educators. And somehow I came across the Sold a Story podcast right at the beginning of my planning year and just blew my mind wide open. And I realized how much I didn't know. And so that was when I started to realize I needed to learn this and I needed to provide this for students.
So now you're ready to start your own school.
Yes.
You're going to start your own school, and you're in Florida, so they can attend. You had a lot of experience at different types of schools, charters, you mentioned
Right.
Title I schools, et cetera. But you opened a micro school.
Yes.
Talk about that. Talk about how that decision was made and because I know that people are going to hear this and they're going to find out you were able to start a school with 5 students.
Hmm.
I'm getting ahead of you in a little bit, but there's a lot in between from the time you decide to do it. Even with 5 students, there's a whole bunch of work. So could you just kind of give us some background on that?
Sure, sure. Again, I think it was during COVID, when I was trying to support teachers and families online. We're all isolated in our different houses. And I would read stories about these pods. And it would be like a teacher is just teaching the neighborhood kids at her kitchen table. And I would think, oh man, that sounds like the way. Just being able to really be with kids at their level and help them learn. That sounds so great versus like navigating these kind of bureaucratic systems. So I think it started then, that concept of the learning pod. And then I just again still want to understand how learning works. And I just thought, I want to make this pilot program and try to take the best of a whole bunch of different systems, put them together, and see if we can really wrap around and support kids. So I knew it was going to be a micro school. I knew it was going to be a small pilot program. But when I was leaving that Title I school and I said I was going to start a school, I started to realize that people were imagining, like a hospital-sized building that I thought I was going to just suddenly, just
Right.
manifest.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of like communication gaps between what I was meaning and what people were hearing.
So thinking about this, and one of the things, like I'm in California and we don't have vouchers for kids.
Mhm.
Parents don't get a voucher and then they could use it for a school, but Florida does that. don't they?
Yes.
Okay. So is that part of how you were able to stay afloat? And was that the only means to be able to support yourself when you're doing this?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, unless you want to make a school just for, wealthy or middle class kids, you have to have a way to fund it. And so the Florida calls them scholarships, but I think it's the exact same thing as a voucher. The scholarships are available to any family who lives in Florida, and they get, a chunk of funding that instead of it going to the public school, the family can bring it with them to the setting that they want to use. So we wouldn't have been able to do it without that program because, again, we didn't want to just duplicate, these wealthy private schools. We wanted to make a school that was universally accessible.
Well, and I think, in prior conversations with you, I think one of the things that you have alluded to it a couple times now, but you really wanted to create a school for kids who are struggling. That
Yes.
and that even to the point of where you located the school.
Yes, absolutely. So again, that science of reading journey, I'm hearing two different things. I'm hearing 95% of kids can learn to read given proper instruction. And I'm seeing that like the, you know, national test results, only 40% of kids are reading on level. And when you look at the subgroups, there's certain subgroups that are underperforming consistently. African American kids, only 1 in 3 reading on level, and that's in Sarasota as well as nationwide. Children with disabilities, also much lower than half, and then children from poverty. And so I thought, well, if there's this 95%, you know, research stat that almost everybody can learn to read given proper instruction, like this is the place to put the school that's based on teaching kids how to read. I should put it where the most need is because those are the kids who currently are not getting what they need.
Now, was this partially, I mean, I know you had a lot of experience, in public schools, private, et cetera. We talked about that. But was this also a holdover from the things that you learned working with kids when you were overseas? That,
I don't know. I don't know. I had lived and taught in New York, in the Caribbean, and in Florida. I just love kids. Kids are kids. But I really wanted to sort of, I don't know, just equalize opportunity. I just look at kids from, two-parent families, two-income families, and just their reality. It's a pretty nice life. And if you become aware of kids with a very different experience, you realize that they are starting behind the starting line. They have to overcome much more just to get to the beginning of the race. And so, I think it was an equity issue for me as well. Just like, how can we change things? We got to start with the youngest kids. We got to give them everything they could possibly need to be successful and smart and just, feel very confident that they belong.
when I hear someone like you describe your work, it is you are the type of people who I want to talk to about, are you successful? You know,
Hmm.
because like you say, other times it's easy. Some kids it's just easy. They come and it doesn't matter what you do. I mean, it's hard to screw them up,
Hmm.
but you're coming and that what you're doing is based on instruction. So
Yeah.
we talked, so when you began this school, 5 kids,
Hmm.
and you had, science of reading. So were
Hmm.
there, so Lucy's kind of in the rearview mirror a little bit.
Hmm.
And so who influenced you about designing your instruction with the science of learning? And what are your influences as you move to a more explicit type of instruction?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I am just soaking up the research like a sponge. That we use UFly for phonics, which is a game changer, because it's this highly scripted, systematic, and explicit phonics curriculum. You don't have to come up with the letter B. You just, go through the sequence, and it's perfectly built with interleaving, space practice, every single thing you could want. And so we did that. Our first year, we were limited to 5 kids, super boring story, but basically, again, a communication issue where by calling this a school, we had to get past the zoning, the city zoning, and the city zoning said if it's a school, it requires indoor fire sprinklers, like the sprinklers in the ceiling, because that's what schools need. And this is a very small building, 2 rooms, 6 exterior exits. But by labeling it a school, we had to raise $130,000 to put in a fire sprinkler system in the ceiling. So 6 kids is what their cutoff was for a school. So we could only have 5 kids our first year until we raised $130,000. So we had 5 kindergarten kids and we used UFly. We didn't do enough with language comprehension. And so we didn't see really like outstanding results our first year. And that was our whole commitment. That was our #1 deliverable. And so the organization I had taken my training from that year that I was planning the school is called the AIM Institute for Learning and Research. And so I was on their mailing list and they said, we're opening up this cohort called Early Reading Success Schools. And you can apply to be in it if you have a screener that you use, if you have a standardized test, and if you have a reading coach. Well, we used the Acadian screener, we used the MAP NWEA standardized test, and I was the reading coach. So I said, yes, we have it. We had 5 kids and they chose us. And that was fantastic because the next year we had 20 kids. And a lot of the kids who came to Star Lab that weren't in kindergarten came because they weren't thriving at their school. And most of our second graders could not read a word. So we really had to deliver and make a difference for these kids. And the AIM partnership, they gave us implementation coaching, and then they coached me as a coach on how to support the teachers in growing their craft. And it was unbelievable. Every week, we would have something that we discussed or some data that I had gathered. And instead of me just spinning my wheels and saying, I don't know that, the teacher says she can't get through the UFly lesson in the 45 minutes. It's supposed to just take 30. She says it takes more than 45 and, because of behavior and this and that. My coach would say, well, she's got to cut something. She has to get it done in 30 minutes and she has to add a fluency practice. And, it was this external accountability that we didn't choose, that was imposed and made such a huge difference. And within a month or two, the teacher's like, I get through it every single day in 30 minutes and there's no behavior anymore. And we do a fluency passage and then we're out for recess on time.
There are several things that are interesting to me, but one question that I need to clarify is from the very beginning with 5 students, you kept saying we, so there was you and one teacher. Is that what you started with?
Well, before the sprinkler disaster, we intended to have 20 students our first year. So I had hired a teacher and an assistant.
Oh, okay.
So we had 3 staff and 5 students.
Okay. So that's important. The other thing that, as I'm listening to you and you're reflecting with your coach, you're talking about 5 students, behavior problems, all the problems that you have. And I think part of that could be who your clientele are, because a lot of the things, you described who your clientele are, they usually don't come to school with like what we might call student behaviors, that those need to be taught in addition to the curriculum. So that's interesting. But one more thing, because I want to follow up on that. And then the other thing is there still needs to be feedback. Something's not working, how important it is to get feedback, because you don't know if you're doing something right or wrong.
Right.
But just that one piece of feedback, well, you got to cut something, and then
Mm-hmm.
you get better at doing that, and then you can do more, and the kids get better behavior. It's just but without that feedback, it's really tough to know what to do.
Yes. And I think that was one of the things that caught us the first year was, yeah, a couple of kids had come and I didn't realize you could be behind in kindergarten. I kind of thought I was starting at the beginning. And so, the kids who didn't know letters, I was like, okay, we'll teach them. But a couple of them did know the letters, and watching their progress was outstanding. So I think one thing that caught us the first year was that we were so impressed with the growth from the kids who had started so far behind and the kids who started well. But we were so impressed with the growth that we didn't realize how far behind they still were.
Based on some proficiency benchmark from the state or something. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. So
Okay.
that was like a very rude awakening because,
Okay.
like I said, we had three staff and five students. It should have
Right.
been
Right.
a
So
whole
you have
lot.
that you have these benchmarks. Are you do you have to abide by all the other things that are going on in the state? Like I don't know what goes on in Florida, but do you have,
Mhm.
you have to do testing and you have to show growth in the number of students proficient, et cetera, et cetera. Do you still have all those obligations?
It's a little different, but to receive the scholarship funding, you do have to submit test results for third grade and up each
Okay.
year.
Okay.
And, I don't think that they would shut you down necessarily if your results are low, but you have to submit them and you have to report to the parents 4 times a year how the kids are doing. So our accountability is more to the parents than to the state. That's really our clientele is the parents. We want to make sure that we're meeting their needs or meeting their expectations or hopefully exceeding their expectations. And that's how we stay in business.
Okay. So we know how you got to the school and we know, but what are you looking for in teachers? What are the teachers? How do you let the teachers know what they're in for? Or how do you select them or criteria for doing this?
Yeah, we made our own interview questions. I've done a lot of interview questions at the public schools. And, there's like a growth mindset question. There's do you know how to use the iReady program question? And, like I wasn't into any of those. We asked things like, what do you think is the role of school in a child and family's life? We just want to hear like somebody who's thinking more of like a big picture. We say, then this one's really important. We are a lab. Star Lab is a lab. Like we're trying to learn and grow and develop knowledge here. As we learn about different practices, there are some that are effective and research aligned, and we try to do those more frequently. And there's others that are not effective or even detrimental. How would you feel about potentially being asked to change your practice? We're like really looking for people who are not locked in. And we ask what you're looking for in a boss, what you're looking for in coworkers. We just want to get somebody who really wants to contribute. And I will say something interesting is that the teacher that we hired for our first year, she's an immigrant and she had been an assistant teacher for years and had not been considered for promotion. And the same with our assistant teacher, she's also an immigrant and she also could not get a full teaching job, even though she was qualified. And so Star Lab actually is a place for people to have opportunities that maybe didn't fit into the general system as well. So they both just work so hard and they're so passionate about the school because they're building it. It's for both of them their first time that they were given that responsibility and that privilege of leading a class.
So you alluded to, saying this is Star Lab. How did you come up with Star Lab as a name for the school?
It was kind of hard when we were applying for the 501(c)(3). I didn't know what the school was even going to be named because I was just like, I don't know, I haven't decided. So our 501(c)(3), like our nonprofit is called Redefine This. I was like, whatever it is, it's going to be different. And then I like, space, I like exploration, I like frontiers. And so I was sort of looking for something like along that lines. I liked, like astronaut maybe or a rocket ship. And so then when it came to star, I was like, well, that has so many layers of meaning for me. One is that obviously the kids, are the stars. But another one is that, you know, all of the elements on Earth were generated in stellar explosions. And so we are literally made of stardust. So metaphorically and physically, I feel like we're stars, we're learning, we're in a lab, and we're growing together.
Very cool. Well, when I talked to you before, you know, God, I had a ton of questions just like I do now. But one of the things especially looking at that your experience in the past, you had done, you started the school for, I hate the terms, but I'm gonna say underprivileged kids, but you had worked in a gifted school, you had worked at Montessori. So as you're putting together your vision of this school, beyond what you did with UFly, we didn't talk about what you did with math, what your math curriculum is, but just the school in general. How did you see the school and the school day in general?
Yeah, I'll just back up for 1 second and say, just like you said, there's some kids that are easy to teach. When I was a teacher, I felt successful. I just loved my class. Saw them learning. Everything was great. I became an administrator because there was kind of a need at the school I was at. And then when you're an administrator, the people that you're talking to on a daily basis are not the people who are thriving necessarily. You're spending a lot of time with the kids who are having issues in their classroom. You're spending a lot of time with the parents who are unhappy with what's going on, or a teacher who's feeling like there's some problems. And so I just became more attuned to the problems in some of the different systems. And not that they affect everybody, not that they're global problems, but they are legitimate problems for some people. So, like, I was a principal at a Montessori school called Island Village Montessori, and I loved it. I loved Montessori. It was just such a homecoming for me in terms of, the beautiful materials, the self-directed learning. But if you watch a kid with ADHD in a Montessori classroom, they aren't necessarily using those beautiful materials and experiencing self-directed learning. If they're hyperactive, they might be, zipping around from one thing to the other. If they're just distracted, they might just be staring off into space. So I saw that as much as Montessori is an incredible model, it doesn't work for every single kid. And then when I went to the gifted school, you know, I saw again this kind of lockstep curriculum where everybody has to be, moving at the same time. There's one teacher and 20 kids. They have to, be progressing. But some of these kids were just, so unique. I know we're all unique, and it just didn't work, and they were very unhappy slash disruptive in different ways. At the Title I school, we had one advanced class per grade level. And I just remember talking to a dad whose third grade son had the highest math score in the whole grade, but a mediocre reading score. And the third grade teacher would not recommend him for the fourth grade advanced class because of his reading score. And the dad was just beside himself. And he said, he's so smart at math. He's going to be so bored in the gen ed math. Can't you please put him there? And we couldn't because, I was actually leaving the school at that time. So it wasn't really my decision. But, there had to be a cutoff. There's only however many seats in that advanced class, and you have to draw the line somewhere. So all of those things, all of these conflicts that I had with students or teachers or parents, I just thought, like, what if there's a different way to approach it where that conflict doesn't exist? So at Star Lab, every kid is on the same path toward proficiency, but they're all at different starting points. And so there is not a cap of who can learn multiplication this year as a second grader. If you're ready for it, you're ready for it. Get going. If you're still working on double digit addition, then that's what you're going to do. So I didn't want to have, curriculum be age based. I also didn't want to have kids just fall through the cracks and just zone out. So we have recess every 45 minutes, the last 15 minutes of every hour. We have recess. And I really wanted to start the day with exercise. Again, I know tons of kids have ADHD. That's a very typical conflict that school and home will have, where school is like, he can't learn. He's all over the place. And the parent's like, I'm not medicating him. He won't eat, and it's like, those are both very valid
Yeah.
concerns. And so, I thought, well, how could you rearrange school so that's not an issue? So we start every day with like 20 minutes of vigorous exercise. Some of it's occupational therapy circuit, some of it's this thing we call run club. And then that recess at the end of every hour, I think really helps. Like, we have kids who have ADHD diagnosed and probably some with undiagnosed. And it's not really an issue. We don't feel like we're telling the parent, you need to deal with this. We're just saying he needs to run around.
Not only he needs to run around, we're going to give him an opportunity to run around. So a couple things you mentioned, you don't want to hold kids back based on the grade. So you mentioned you started with 5 students and then you're adding another grade and you're adding another grade. So trying to put a couple of ideas together. So when you are teaching math or reading, are they ungraded? Will the kids move to different groups so that you create homogeneous groups for that?
Yes, so we do have groups. Obviously, not everybody's one-on-one. And then I was just looking at a picture of some kids reading Charlie and the Chocolate Factory last year, and it was a first grader, a second grader, and 2 third graders. That was like that reading group because those were the kids who were ready for that reading level.
Okay, so and some folks could say, well, you can handle that because you how few kids you have. But I could see if you had 3 kids in a group, you could easily have 6 kids in a group
Mhm.
as the school builds. So you talked about some things that you did additionally. The recess starting with vigorous activity
Mhm.
is that I'm laughing because how many times do we read this? But we don't
Mhm.
do it. We don't do it.
Mhm.
Plus, I imagine your teachers have opportunities to go to the bathroom more frequently too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I will say that our staffing ratio is still awesome. Last year, we had 20 kids, 2 teachers, and 2 assistants. So we always have this like 1 to 5 ratio. Next year, we're going to have 50 kids with 4 teachers and 4 assistants. So, we really can customize things for the kids. And I think that's where the money should go. It costs a certain amount to run a school, but you know, 85% of it needs to go to salaries because those are the people who are going to make the
Right.
difference.
So we talked about a couple of things that you do differently, recess, grouping, anything that you stopped doing that most schools do.
I mean, in Florida, they have just certain laws that I understand the origin, but it doesn't necessarily make sense in every classroom in the whole state. So
Yeah.
one is, and this was for public and charter, elementary students need to have a 90-minute uninterrupted reading block. So when you're making your master schedule, you've got to make sure that, there's no lunch or specials in the middle of it. To my mind, I'd rather have two 45-minute reading blocks, one that's more for foundational skills and one that's more for language comprehension with a recess in the middle.
Yeah.
Just if you've ever met a kindergartner, you might agree. So that was one thing that we stopped doing. And then the other thing that I mean, I really think that I can learn a lot about MTSS and tier one, tier two, tier three support. But for us, what we can do is we can move a kid's placement that minute. We don't have to go through like 6 weeks of data collection and a committee and, signing off by the school psychologist and all that. We, like when everybody started school last year, and I said most of our second graders couldn't read, we didn't start them in the kindergarten reading group. We started them in the first grade reading group because they knew their letters. But the first grade reading group started with digraphs.
Yeah.
So we had 5 kindergartners and 1 first grader learning letters. We had, 4 first graders and 4 second graders learning digraphs. And then we had a few second graders and some first graders who were on level. So we had everybody sorted out in different places. But by January, the kids who were in the groups that were lower than their age had not really closed the gap. So they were being successful in their lower group, but we realized that we were not closing the gap by teaching them at a lower level. And so I talked to the teachers and said, I think we got to put them at their grade level group now and then just fill in with, some interventions to help them like close the gap of whatever they missed. And so we did that, and then their year-end data was much stronger. But again, it's so flexible. We can pivot, just really right in response to the a test score or an observation.
Right. You know what? One thing we didn't talk about that many people talk about when they're attempting to provide interventions with kids is use of technology.
Hmm.
How much technology do you use in instruction at Star Lab?
Pretty much zero. None. We have, screens for presentations and then that's it. I like that Fact Freaks program. Like I like the idea of like some things that kids can just practice on their own, but
Yeah.
it didn't really engage our kids. And so we just, use paper pencil for fluency building.
And everything's worked out so far.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Wow. This is awesome. I mean, this is really terrific. Do you have any advice for folks listening to this and say, wow, that's a great idea. I would like to pursue this micro school idea?
I would say it is great, and it was extremely hard. As I was saying goodbye at my Title I school, I was saying goodbye to like the head of the cafeteria, and I was like, oh, wait, that's going to be me now. And then I said goodbye to the bookkeeper, and I was like, oh man, how do you do that again? And then I said goodbye to the custodian, and I was like, so what do you do every morning? So, it's challenging because even though it's a smaller number of kids, it's still a large number of categories of things that need to get done. But I would also say that there are some really interesting foundations that want to support early stage schools. And so the one that helped me is called the Drexel Fund. And I applied for their founders program. I applied for it twice. The first year I didn't get in, but the second year I did. And that was absolutely transformative because I was in a small cohort. There were six of us. And then we had, monthly meetings and weekly coaching, and we got to go to, visit different schools and just learn a lot about the task ahead of us. It's a big task, but it's very worthwhile.
It sounds like, and again, kudos for who you decided your clientele were going to be. Because I think, if you talk about a lab, I think we want to look for things that work in the most challenging places,
Mhm.
because I think then we've got something. In addition to small class sizes, okay, somebody walked into Star Lab and spent the morning, what would the biggest difference that they would see from regular schools that they might, or other schools?
You know, I think that the kids and teachers are so empowered here. When I walk through the classrooms, kids will grab my sleeve and say, I just mastered a skill. And the teachers will say, oh my gosh, look at him. He just learned double digit addition with regrouping. Everything is so granular that people really feel like they have control over it. It's not like, yeah, I got a B plus in math. I'm so excited. But it's like, look at these skills I've checked off on that path and look what's coming next. And that's a kind of from Montessori. In Montessori, you can track your progress as you progress through the materials on the shelves, but we put it into a spreadsheet that kind of lights up as the kids progress through the different objectives. And it is so cool to see how excited they are. We ring the bell outside when they master a skill. And this is the other thing, like that's talking about the kids, but here's the thing about the teachers. Our first year, we had kindergarten graduation for the five kids. And that morning, the teacher was still teaching because she said this kid is going to count to 100. And the kid was like, 79, 50, 51, 52, 53. And the teacher was like, no, no, let's do it again. And so she was still teaching. And I told her, I've never worked at a school like that, where, because usually the 2 weeks before the last day of school is kind of chill, like helping the teacher pack up boxes and watching movies and, PJ day. But at our school, the teachers just feel like they can make a difference. And then they can see that visible difference as our, dashboard lights up different colors. And so, I mean, everybody just believes, and it's really exciting.
That is awesome. That's great. Uh, Allison, I could talk forever, and I probably will be contacting you to the point of you think I'm a stalker. But so, do you have any questions for me before we go?
I do. I do. I am a super fan of your book, Teach Fast. I read it on an airplane and I got off the plane and emailed my whole staff and said, next week, give me one of your lessons. I'm teaching it and you're watching me. And I got the experience because I wasn't a teacher, I was the head of
Uh,
the school. So
Yeah.
I got to do 4 Teach Fast lessons in December, all different ones. One was on needs of plants, one was on, I think, money, all different categories. One was in music. And so the teachers loved it because your framework is so explicit that the kids, by the end of the lesson, know the content and they're confident because you taught it to them. It's so clear. And so for Christmas, I asked the teachers if anybody wanted your book. They all did. I ordered them all your book. And I did see evidence, absolutely saw evidence of it in use in the spring. But we're bringing on some new teachers now, and I just wanted to ask if you had any advice about teaching this lesson plan framework the most efficiently and effectively.
Well, I used to believe that, the book was good, but you needed the in-person training.
Hmm.
And then this past year, I've had an opportunity to do some virtual coaching, with folks who I didn't train, but I just read the book. And I was so amazed at how well they did with the lesson structure. There were a couple things, that they had questions about or needed help with, but it goes back to what our conversation earlier about if they just had a little bit of coaching, just a
Hmm.
little bit, they could get over it. Because like everything, you do something and you think you're doing it the way you're supposed to, but it's just a little tweak and oh yeah, now I get it. So I think, what you're doing, you need to have it modeled. They need to see it modeled. And
Hmm.
then you help design a lesson with, just bring them through a coaching cycle and watch
Hmm.
them teach, and they'll get it because like you said, or maybe you didn't say this, but I'm going to say it just makes sense because it flows, and because it flows so well that if something doesn't work in the lesson, now you have places to go back and reflect. Oh, how was my modeling? How was my,
Hmm.
how, so you can do it, especially now with somebody like you, Allison, who has been through it. But it is like anything, with regards to the learning hierarchy. You need the acquisition, then you need the fluency. You can't
Hmm.
do this once. You need to get to the fluency level. And it's really critical for you as a person who's going to be doing the coaching to get to that fluency level because you need to go beyond to generalize to be able to say, okay, this wasn't my lesson, but I still need to give that specific feedback.
Thank you.
So, I appreciate the kind words. I'm glad it's making a difference. And boy, anytime, anything else. One thing before we go, you mentioned you've got a 501(c)(3),
Hmm.
and unfortunately, always part of that work is raising funds. Is there a way if people are interested to help you with some of these fundings?
Absolutely, yes. That was an eye-opening part of the job because I'm pretty much like an independent person, where I'm like, okay, if something needs to be done, I'll just do it. But it turns out that fundraising is an essential part of most nonprofit organizations. And so we receive about $9,000 per student from the state, but the cost of our tuition is 11,500. So we fundraise for that gap because we don't charge the families anything. And we have a webpage, www.starlab.world, and then there is a link to donate if anybody wants to get involved.
All right, and we will be sure to put that in the show notes. Certainly worthwhile, and again, every student that is coming to this school is a worthy student.
Absolutely. There
All
are
right.
stars.
Yeah, Allison, it has been so wonderful talking to you, and I can't wait to talk soon.
Thank you so much, Jean. Have a great day.
You too. If you're enjoying these podcasts, tell a friend. Also, please leave a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. You can follow me on Blue Sky at G Tavernetti, on Twitter, X at G Tavernetti, and you can learn more about me and the work I do at my website, tesscg.com. That's TESSCG.com, where you will also find information about ordering my books, Teach Fast, Focused Adaptable Structured Teaching, and maximizing the impact of coaching cycles.